Hello, we are in Lithuania. This venue is of Vilnius Gaon State Jewish History Museum. We are presenting a roundtable discussion on some significant art and cultural topics of history, common both to Austria and Lithuania, on the occasion and as a prelude of exhibition in Vilnius of the works of Austrian painter Arik Brauer. However, we have decided to go, using this occasion, into a broader context of cultural heritage. My name is Markas Zingeris. I'm a writer and former director of this museum, and I will be moderating this event. The participants are, on Austrian side, Ambassador of Austria to Lithuania, Ivona Toncic-Skorin, Director of Vienna Jewish Museum, Dr. Daniele Spera. On Lithuanian side, Dr. Lara Lempert, she is affiliated with Lithuania's National Library, and Dr. Simona Skaisgirytė is an art historian and owner of auction house in Vilnius. Now, the question, and I will address Madam Ambassador Toncic-Skorin. As far as we can recall, there were allegedly more Nazi Party members in Vienna's Philharmonic Orchestra than in Berlin's Philharmonic Orchestra. So Austria during the war, Second World War, was heavily Nazified. A number of high-ranking Nazis were of Austrian background. On the other hand, Austria, as it is a fact of history, had a rich Jewish contribution to its national culture, say Mahler, Stefan Zweig, whole elite of musicians, artists of fine art, not to mention philosophy, etc. And this heritage was eliminated from national culture, while the National Socialism was in power. So when and how Austrian Jewish legacy became part of Austrian general heritage and identity again? Please, Madam Ambassador, your turn.
Thank you for this very pertinent question, which has many facets. Of course, the answer is not a very straight one. There is not a one single answer to this issue, but may I first step in what you said, that Jewish culture has been eliminated. I think the Jewish culture has not been eliminated because the heritage of this Jewish culture is so mainstreamed in Austrian culture. You cannot remove it. But what has been removed is the remembrance and the consciousness that it is Jewish origin, that it is Jewish culture. So what the challenge is, of course, is to make people aware of the fact that it was the Jewish citizens of Austria who contributed with their knowledge and with their expertise and with their genius to what is Austria today. And this has not happened for a very, very long time, for too long. What we witnessed after the war in Austria is that we were, after the war was over, Austria was re-established as a sovereign state only 10 years after the war. There was occupation time until 1955. We had the four foreign powers occupying Austria, and then after 1955, the restoration of statehood in Austria was the main goal and the main common effort in Austria. There was almost no discussion on responsibility, be it collective, be it individual responsibility for what happened during the war. And also, as a consequence, not a discussion on the victims. Not enough discussion on the victims. And the victims, of course, were those who were killed, but also those who had to flee and who had to leave the country. This was changed. This changed, or was changed, you can also say, because it was, it came from outside. It didn't come from ourselves, I must say. It was the discussion on the role of the then Austrian president Kurt Waldheim in the 80s. So when he was Secretary General of the United Nations before, and then he became president. And during the campaign, it became clear that he has a past as member of the Wehrmacht and SS, yes, and SR to be continued. And so this kind of was a trigger for the discussion, first on his responsibility, but then of course also on the responsibility of decision makers in Austria that still were in their role after the war, and also the question of, is there a collective responsibility? This changed one fundamental mantra of post-World War Austria. This is the question, was Austria a victim of Nazi Germany or not? Yes, there is, that Austrians were active is no doubt, but that the country was not, and its citizens were not victims, but they were also the perpetrators. So this was the fundamental game change in the 80s, and we started then, and then the next step after Waldheim, he became president then, and this triggered after the finish of his tenure in 1991, a lot of initiatives were put in place to start the discussion on collective and individual responsibility in Austria. And with this discussion, there was the look on the victims. And this is, I would say, the trigger. You have to first look in the mirror and say who did what, and then you also open the perspective on the victims. But then you can have an honest discussion on the victims. And this is what happened. There were so many activities, then we can look at them in detail. There were the funds, the two big national funds on compensating the losses that the victims had to suffer. There were many legal instruments put in place in order to ensure that this discussion can have a political, a financial, and a legal framework. I think this is the basic necessity in order to start to look at what cultural and heritage means and meant for Austria, and what the losses are, is that you put a basis for this discussion in the public, and this is the responsibility of the political side. But then I always say there is no collective responsibility for the crimes, but there is a collective responsibility for the way how we deal with the Second World War today.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Ambassador. We have a rather varied discussion on various aspects, and Maestro Brauer triggered us to some very interesting questions. So now I would address a Lithuanian participant, and it's a question for Dr. Lara Lambert. It's rather obvious that national or ethnic identities of nations, be it 19th century or 21st century, are usually based on their selective historical narratives. The problem, however, is which part of the narrative becomes relevant during the formation of an ethnic group or a nation or a religious minority. The mentality of a victim and various historical resentments and also religion are usually instrumental in organizing of population or a group on national grounds. So, Dr. Lambert, is identity of the Jews in Lithuania nourished by similar patterns? What constitutes an identity of the so-called Litvak? In your view, please.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I believe it would be a subject of different and separate and long discussion. But as in the framework of our discussion here, I'll try to be brief and express my views briefly. You're absolutely right that the general patterns work in different historical periods. But if we speak of Lithuanian Jews, and if we use the term Litvaks, it's of course, a great difference, not so much between the, let's say, 19th century and 21st century, but between the pre- and post-Holocaust periods. For the identity of the Litvaks, and even for the usage of the term, this distinction is critical. I just will remind the historical backgrounds very shortly and very briefly that the term Litvaks was of the term itself in Genesis of the beginning of the 20th century, differently that people think, because people usually now tend to think that it is a very old term. It is not so. The Lithuanian Jewish identity was defined in various and different terms before the term Litvak was coined. And it was coined not by the Lithuanian Jews. It was coined by their Polish counterparts as a pejorative, actually. And the proud Lithuanian Jews just hijacked the term and made it a part of their own identity. So in the beginning, it's just the Lithuanian Jewish way of life, which is defined by the term Litvaks. It's not a geographical so much as social cultural term in its original, not the original, but the second step on the way when Lithuanian Jews already adopted this term as a self-definition. So it is and that way of life and that type of religious, mainly religious culture, religious literacy and strive for knowledge could be even then not connected precisely to the geography, to the Lithuanian borders, as we know Lithuania now. It was much more diffuse and actually regardless of those borders, and this way of life and thinking we find in nowadays Lithuania, nowadays Belarus, nowadays parts of Ukraine and Latvia, and more. And we shouldn't forget that already from the end of the 19th century and very massively in the first decades of the 20th century, mass emigration of Lithuanian Jews as well as other ethnicities from that region, but let's stop with Jews, occurred, and this type of living, this type of thinking was exported to much broader, geographically broader territory, and of course was when Jews of that type of that I'm speaking about, Litvak type of consciousness, I would say, would come to USA or South Africa or Great Britain or wherever. They would adapt to the local situation, but they would also preserve some parts of their original identity. But all this is constant process. In the meaning of Litvak, there is no from that period, from the beginning of the 19th century, there is no constanta. There are changing things with some nucleus, which is there all the time, with all that adds to that and changes. So it's the pre-Holocaust stage. And the post-Holocaust stage, and our type of Jewish consciousness here in Lithuania is very different from that one. For us, and when I say us, I mean the nowadays Jewish community here in Lithuania and also abroad. Jews who are originally from Lithuania, maybe from Soviet Lithuania, but now lives not in Lithuania. Litvak is mainly the term of provenance, not much more, because the Jewish community in Lithuania, even before the Holocaust, was very much secular. It had very strong religious segments, but also the secular Jewish consciousness was very, very prominent already then. So if somebody today says he's a Litvak, we don't need to understand that he is a Litvak of the type of Vilna Gaon, right? For whom his identity was very much grounded in the religious consciousness and knowledge of religious texts. No, today is, you could say it's more primitive, but I will come to that in a second. It's just more straightforward today. Today, Litvaks are Jews of Lithuania who survived the war, or their children and grandchildren. But still, it's not primitive. It was a provocative term from my part, because we have now a different aspect to that term which couldn't exist before the Holocaust, the nostalgic one, the nostalgia dimension. That let people identify with Lithuania, with the lost Jewish Lithuania, even by that one criterion, geographical one. They know Lithuania as a land, as the land of their ancestors, of their grandparents and parents who mainly didn't survive. And they know also Lithuania in small details of their birthplaces. And all that memory is so dear and so painful at the same time that I would say that this is the main content of the term Litvak today. It is very, very different.
Thank you, Dr. Lempert, but I would like to ask you immediately, if you identify a Litvak by a geographical location at present in post-Holocaust period, what about the significant influx of the Soviet Jewry into Lithuanian Jewish community after the war? So are they also Litvaks? The Jews from Moscow, the Jews from Leningrad, and so on?
First of all, today, some of those people, not them, maybe themselves, as much as their children, their second and third generation here in Lithuania, do adapt this term for themselves. We could ask and question this, is it an appropriation? In some instances, yes. Me, myself, as a Ukrainian Jew, by birth, I never adopt this term for myself personally, but I'm proud to become a part of purely Litvak family, and maybe I flatter myself to that I imagine that I adopted also some of this Lithuanian Litvak way of thinking. But still, if somebody who is 30 now and lives in Vilnius, and whose grandfather or grandparents came from, not from here, he now says he's a Litvak, I would say it's a very healthy ambition, because Litvak is still a sign of pride, and if people want to identify with that, I would prefer that they also work towards that. But even if they only want to identify with that, let them.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lempert. Now, Dr. Sperr, as we see, the important issue of this discussion is a culture of remembrance. So what you can say about this?
I want, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege for us to be here in your wonderful country and to present the works of Arik Brauer. And I want to catch up what Mrs. Ambassador had said about Austrian history, that Austria had a very improper dealing with the past, and I may present a small presentation where I'm telling the story of the culture of remembrance. So Austria, until the so-called Waldheim affair that the ambassador already talked about, had a very improper dealing with the past, even though Austria had a Jewish chancellor with Bruno Kreisky, as you can see him here. And you can see Simon Wiesenthal very painfully visiting a Jewish cemetery which was smeared by swastikas, as you can see, in the 1980s. And Simon Wiesenthal was urging that Austria should build a Shoah monument, and his idea was to put it on the Judenplatz, which you can see here in former times. Judenplatz was the center of Jewish life in the Middle Ages. It was a really important Jewish community which lived over centuries in Vienna, with very important rabbis teaching there. And in 1421 this community was completely killed and expelled. The synagogue was torn down, and afterwards it was a space, a square. No houses were there on this square, and nobody knew exactly where the synagogue was located. So, and Wiesenthal said it should be built there. And when the ground was opened up to build the Shoah monument, the excavations of the medieval synagogue were found. And this was like a double miracle, you know, to remember the Shoah and to find these excavations. And I think this is important also to you here in Vilnius, because you're looking for your grand synagogue. So maybe this could be an example of what you could do with it. Of course, after the excavations, we could tell approximately how the synagogue would have looked like. And if you go to Prague, it would remind you of the Altneue Schule a little bit. And what the city then did, they found a space, they formed a space where you can visit the excavations, and this is what we're doing in our museum. We're telling the story of the medieval synagogue. Nevertheless, even though the monument was built, it was opened in the year 2000, and now the space and the square looks totally different, if you remember my the first slides. Remembrance now this is the place of remembrance. Every state visit is going there, and yeah, it's a really, really important place. What we're doing down there, we're celebrating the tradition. As you can see here, we're celebrating Hanukkah with young people, not only from the Jewish community, but throughout. And now we created an augmented reality possibility so that you really can feel how the synagogue would have looked like when it would still be there. We also included tactile elements so that people who are blind or cannot hear, that they could see and feel how the Jewish community was formed at that period of time, and they also can touch the Shoah monument. Since a couple of months, we also have a wall of names, which was a really important task for us. For me personally, as my family members now for the first time have a place where we can remember them. They were killed in Mali Trostinets, and there's nothing that remembers my family, and I'm really, really so glad that I can go there and pray for them. It's very important. For us at the Jewish Museum, it's important to show a vanished Jewish history. As you can see on the right-hand picture, it's a regular building, a communal building, and you can see on the other two pictures was what was there before. It was a very important synagogue, the Turkish temple. It was the Sephardic community in Austria, and after 1938, in the November pogrom, all the synagogues were destroyed, and after the war, the ruins were just put away, and they built communal buildings there. As you can see here, you can see the buildings, the new buildings and models of the old buildings. So what was our idea? We wanted to create a remembrance symbol in front of all the 25 important and big synagogues of Vienna, and we asked the university, the class for transmedial art, with the important light artist Brigitte Kowans, who unfortunately just passed away a couple of weeks ago, at a very young age, unfortunately. So her students created light symbols, and we had a competition. We looked at all the different ideas, and finally the winning project was by Lukas Kaufmann. He had the idea to form a Star of David, but it's not a regular form of a Star of David. You only, if you stand underneath of this light symbol, you can see what it is. And it's really beautiful, the prototype we have in the Jewish Museum now. And now on 25 spaces in Vienna, you have this beautiful light symbol, so everybody can see what was there. And before you could not realize what was there. We had important visitors also there, and you can see in the background, it's a very, a building where you would not know what was there in former times. So, and what we did also with the synagogues, we tried to visualize them with a beautiful project with the Technical University of Vienna. 2 professors with their students recreated the synagogues, and maybe this is a small video where we can see, sorry. Yes. You really can walk into the synagogue and you can feel the atmosphere. And I think this is a wonderful project, and we're doing this now throughout the monarchy, so we're all recreating also the other synagogues. Remembrance, of course, is very important for us. Remembrance through education. This is what we're doing every day. We have artifacts out of the synagogues which we left in the state that how they were found, and we have a very important tool, and I'd really want to briefly introduce that. Lily's box. Lily Bial was the only child of Jewish parents. She could leave Vienna via children's transport, but the children could only take a suitcase and nothing else. So the parents of Lily packed a box with her childhood things. But the box never left Vienna because the parents were deported and killed. So only after the war the box was found, and only in the year 2004 we found Lily again. She was still living in Great Britain. She never had returned, and so my predecessor went with the box to her and wanted to bring her the box, and she was overwhelmed because she had not seen her photos of her parents, not her childhood things, and she said, "I cannot keep this box. Please take it with you and use it for educational purposes." And this is what we're doing every day with school classes, with our students that come, because everybody can relate to this story, and everybody has something that he would like to take with him or with her if you have to leave, even if it's only for a trip somewhere. So what we also did, we started programs for refugees from the Middle East. They started to come to Austria in 2015, the war in Syria. So we're working with them, and we're working with the box. And this is so important because for the first time they can relate to the Jewish faith, because they come with an education that Jews means equals Israel equals enemy. So, and this is really important what we're doing there. So we try to build bridges, as our dear friend Arik Brauer did, and you can see Arik Brauer here. And this is now my bridge to this exhibition. Arik Brauer came from this family. You can see his father here, Simche Brauer. Segal was his family name. He was born in Kaunas. He then moved to Vilnius. Actually, he should have been a cantor. He had a beautiful voice, like his son Arik, and also his wife and his daughters. So, he went to Vienna. He became a shoemaker there. He met his wife Hermine, who you can see here. They had 2 children, and on the right-hand side it's Arik, who was called Erich as his birth name, and Simche wanted to take his family out after the Anschluss. He went to Riga, but unfortunately he was deported and killed there. So the small family stayed in Vienna, and the children were hidden until the end of the war. And after the war, Arik became one of the most outstanding painters. And this painting of his father, My Father in Winter, is one of his really most emotional paintings. And he said, even though he reconciled, but the memory of his father is very deep in his heart. He was a universal artist, as you can see here, all of my arts. This is a mosaic that's on his house, on the residence where he lived. All of his arts, he was a painter, he was a dancer, he was a sculptor, he was a singer, a composer, so a really, really incredible universal artist. He also became a rock star by coincidence when he started to sing, and this is so important what you said about identity, you know, because he started to sing in the Viennese dialect because he felt as being a Viennese, being Jewish and Viennese, and this is wonderful, and this is just a small excerpt of his singing, and maybe we can listen a little bit so that you can hear also his voice. This is also very important. He drove with his, oh sorry, we have to go to the next slide. He's talking about driving with his bicycle. He was one of the first green movement supporters, and he drove with his bicycle through all over Europe and to Africa. But dealing with the past was, of course, very important also in his very early works. As you can see, it's on the right-hand side, it says Man in a Gas Chamber. So this was something, it was deep in his mind all the time. But at the same time, he wanted to celebrate life. This was his utmost goal. Here you can see him with his wife and his daughters and his granddaughters, so it's a mainly female-dominated family. And of course, what we are presenting here is the new Haggadah. It's the story of Pesach, which we will celebrate in a couple of weeks. The story of the liberation. We went with these paintings through different countries and different cities, and it was always wonderful to also to be with him, and we miss him dearly here in Vilnius. He would have loved to be here. We also went to Venice with this exhibition. And yeah, unfortunately, he left us last year, and he will always be remembered. And yeah.
Thank you for your presentation,
Dr.
Dr.
lengthy,
Sperr.
but I hope I gave you a small impression.
Oh, somehow reminded me of Bob Dylan.
Yes.
Okay. What we have now is Dr. Skaisgirytė Makselienė. To what tradition or style, looking from aside, would relate the works of Arik Brauer, rather, if you compare him to Litvak artists of the past century or internationally with modern Jewish painters who emigrated from this country to USA, France, Latin America, say Segal of Brazil or Jose Gurvich of Nicaragua? So to what tradition or style relates the works of Arik Brauer in your view? Would you put him with, say, paintings of Hundertwasser or to something else? It's very interesting to see, to hear a fresh view on it.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me here to know better the creative legacy of this author, who is of Lithuanian origin, but I have to admit that he is not well known here in Lithuania, and art historians, I'm afraid that they are not introduced to his work here. So it's really an important thing that complements the field of Litvak art. So thank you for making this exhibition here. Now, from the art theoretical perspective, Arik Brauer, I would put him somewhere in the middle of surrealism and naivism, or primitive art. So I think it's a very interesting mix of both surreal and naive way of thinking. Of course, he uses biblical themes, and Jewish folklore is one of his main inspirations. From the formal point of view, he is very illustrative and narrative, decorative. He tends to pettiness, to use a lot of ornamentation. Sometimes we can feel that he has this horror vacui when he tends to fill all the surface of his artwork with frivolous and small details, etc. So now, if we want to compare him to other sources of inspiration, so there are several of them. I can compare to some naive painters, such as, for example, Niko Birosmani, Sakartvelian painter, to a certain extent. Then to Jewish Ruben Röven, who also gets his inspirations from not only biblical motives, but also from this even deeper and more archaic Jewish folk tradition, which is still mixed with some myth and legends and archetypes, etc. Then, as a true Viennese painter, he is apparently also very familiar with the Viennese tradition of surrealism. And I have first of all in mind Alfred Kubin, who was a surrealist painter and mythical one, and so on. Then we can go even deeper and try to find some connotations and common points with such authors as Willem Blake, was also very dedicated to religious themes and creating his own, so to say, universe. Even more, he was very much conscious about what was going on presently. So if we look especially into his concert performances, so we can trace elements of pop art and even maybe to Dada, a little bit of Dada, especially in his costumes and in the way that he makes, in fact, the whole coherent performance, both singing and showing his art on the backstage and with his costumes, etc., etc. So it has all those echoes of Dadaism, of pop art, of surreal thinking. So all of them are present there. We have also to mention his connection to what maybe you have already mentioned, the Vienna school of fantastic realism, that was very interesting thing after the Second World War. It was formed by the Professor Albert Gütersloh and in Vienna Academy of Arts, and there were the big five, the five painters who really achieved some international success and became famous, and Arik Brauer was one of them. So what is common for all this group is, first of all, emphasis on the technique of old masters. You can see that they were very, very paint in such a minuscule and sometimes even in a miniaturistic tradition, and they did not follow the abstract expressionism that prevailed in Europe, in France, and in the United States immediately after the Second World War. Then they ground it in surrealism, in realism and surrealism. That is, you always can recognize the figures, but of course they are put and connected in some surreal way of connections, of associations. So all of them, they have this inexhaustible source of folk tales, fairy tales, of dreams. They make it, and especially Arik Brauer, I think, he mixes Western, Jewish, and Oriental influences in his works, and he somehow dives into the realm of dreams and this oniric space of some free associations. Also, we can mention his friendship to Friedrich Hundertwasser, who was in himself a very interesting personality, and the artistic language have quite a lot of things in common. Now, concerning this cycle that we have here, it's dedicated to biblical theme, so you can recognize biblical motives, etc. But if you have a broader look, he's even more oniric, and you can have more those free and surreal associations. So, to be very brief.
Thank you very much. You are brief, but you are very comprehensive. Thank you. So, to give it a spark of discussion, I would like to see the reaction of Dr. Speer.
Yeah, very briefly to catch up on that. When Arik Brauer started to study at the academy shortly after the war, or immediately after the war, of course, and he was concentrating on biblical and Jewish topics, his teachers were still teachers from the Nazi period of time. So they were sort of looking at this very cautiously and very carefully. But also his friendship with Hundertwasser or Ernst Fuchs, for example, I mean, they really were close friends. They were traveling by bicycle to Paris, where they then later lived, to Israel, to Africa together. And very important is also the issue of the climate. I mean, we're talking now about climate change, and these guys like Hundertwasser and Brauer, Fuchs, they were so concentrated and so conscious about preserving the nature. You know, this is also a very modern thought, and this you also can find in his work. He's reflecting a lot about the nature, and actually the horror vacui I don't see at all, because he's really such a refined artist, and everything is so full with mythical and nature and all these topics, and of course the Bible, the Torah. And sometimes he reminds me also on Chagall. So I see also Chagall. I see Chagall. I see Chagall. And just finally, because he was born Erich, and he then moved to Israel, and he met his wife Naomi, and she could not pronounce Erich, because you do not have this in the Hebrew language, in Ivrit. So she called him Arik, and since then he's Arik.
And Aryeh is in Hebrew a lion, right?
Arik, he's Arik. Arik from Erich. No, it's from Erich.
Just from Erich.
Yeah, just from
someone who reminds me of Aryeh.
But he could be an Aryeh, definitely.
Yeah, sure. Good. Thank you very much, Dr. Speer. So we had this brief, but I believe interesting overlook of our upcoming exhibition at Vilna Gaon State Jewish History Museum in Vilnius. And one of the reasons we have decided to discuss these issues, I will repeat myself and remind you, is that Austrian and Lithuanian Jewish heritage still has some pressing issues and common traits if we compare them together. The other is, unfortunately, is what is going on in our geopolitical realm, in our geographical neighborhood. The reason for the war, which Russia started, is falsely claimed by Moscow to be a denazification of Ukraine. And we know that the real meaning of the term. And Germany and Austria presents to us the real painful way after the Second World War to denazify the society and the cultural upbringing and to bring back the Jewish memory and the Jewish heritage. Is so we are aware of the use and abuse and cheapening of the concept of Holocaust and denazification in present times. And we wanted to go back to the real content of these terms and to discuss it for an hour and for our general viewer in its real terms and in depth. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for viewing us. This is Vienna Golden State Jewish Museum. Marka Zingeris was the moderator. Thank you all the participants.